There were 3 of them. Born in silence. Eyes wide open. Breathing before their cords were cut. And they never cried, not even when the bloodhounds passed inches above their heads. Most people aren't ready to hear what I'm about to say. That's not a dramatic warning. That's a line in the sand. Because once you cross it, once you let this story in, it won't leave you the same. This isn't the kind of tale you'll find in textbooks or documentaries. This is the kind that gets left out on purpose. The kind of truth that makes powerful people uncomfortable. You're not supposed to know about what happened on that February night in 1856. And yet here you are. Still watching. Still listening. That tells me something about you. It tells me you've already started falling down the rabbit hole. And the deeper we go, the more disturbing it gets. Cedar Mills, Ohio. A place barely worth a footnote in the grand narrative of American history. But beneath its frozen ground, something unnatural was born. The woman who gave birth to the triplets. She had no last name. No documented past. Only a first name, Ruth. A runaway, they said. But the truth is, she wasn't just running from chains. She was running from something older. Something that still has no name. She arrived days before the bloodhounds came, belly full and eyes haunted. The Quakers who took her in thought they were saving a woman. What they didn't know is that they were about to become custodians of a force that would tear at the seams of reality itself. The children came without pain, without sound. One by one, emerging as if summoned. Alert. Watching. Listening. The room filled with something that wasn't fear, but wasn't peace either. It was weight. Pressure. The sense that something irreversible had just occurred. The midwife who delivered them would never again speak in public. And when asked, she simply said, "They knew me, before they saw me. You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't meant to feel this. But now it's in you. And once you hear what these boys became, what they saw, what they knew, you'll never trust the world the same way again." The town had secrets long before that night. Quaker silence is often mistaken for peace, but beneath it, generations of unspoken truths festered like roots under old floorboards. And yet even their deepest hidden sins could not prepare them for what Ruth carried. She didn't scream during labor. She didn't flinch. Her breathing was steady, calculated, like a woman following instructions she hadn't spoken aloud. The triplets arrived within minutes of each other, each one calm, each one watching the world with a gaze that unsettled even the most faithful among them. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. These were not ordinary children. The Garrett brothers were just miles away when the last child was born. 6 men, armed and ruthless, following the scent of human fear with dogs bred for the hunt. They weren't bounty hunters in the modern sense. They were predators with badges. Their business was blood. But when they reached the meeting house, when they stood above the trapdoor under which the infants lay, something stopped them. Not evidence. Not reason. Something invisible. The dogs refused to bark. The strongest of them whimpered and turned away. And the babies remained silent. Not a whimper. Not a breath out of place. It was as if they understood the stakes. As if they had been born with an instinct more ancient than language. A survival that came not from the womb, but from somewhere much deeper. Somewhere not human. When the men left, empty-handed and confused, Ruth finally allowed herself to speak. Not in English. Not in any tongue Martha Whitmore had ever heard. The words sounded like water running backwards, fluid, rhythmic, unnatural. She whispered it to her sons, one final chant before her body collapsed, blood leaking from places no one could stop. Her final words weren't a prayer. They were a warning, they'll know. Even when they're not meant to. And you must protect them, from them. But who they were, she never said. And that silence was louder than any prophecy. Because those boys would grow. And the world around them would begin to break, one lie at a time. Not because they wanted it to, but because they couldn't help it. They were born knowing. Born watching. Born different. And difference is dangerous. When they turned 1 year old, the whispers started. Not among strangers, but within the very walls that had protected them. It began with small observations, too small to call supernatural, too frequent to ignore. Caleb would walk into a room before anyone heard the knock. Ezra would cry moments before news arrived of someone's death 3 counties over. And Isaac. Isaac stared. Not like a child discovering the world, but like a man dissecting it. He looked through people. And they felt it. Martha Whitmore kept a diary, locked in a chest beneath her floorboards, because even she was afraid of what her words meant. In one entry, she wrote, "They knew when I lied." Not with anger, but with a sort of disappointment, like I'd failed some unspoken test. She wasn't alone. Others in the community confessed the same. They avoided speaking half-truths in front of the boys. They'd lower their gaze like they were standing before judges, not toddlers. By age 2, the triplets no longer played with other children. Not because they were aggressive, but because the other children couldn't stand to be around them. Dogs barked at them for no reason. Horses refused to be ridden when they were near. Lamps flickered. Clocks stopped. The excuses began piling up: drafts, bad oil, coincidence. But coincidence doesn't repeat itself every day for 2 years. One autumn afternoon, a man came through Cedar Mills claiming to be a runaway seeking shelter. The boys were in the room. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. But they all turned to face him, at the exact same moment. Their eyes locked onto his, and the man froze. He began to sweat. He stammered. He left. That night, the town got word. The man had been seen entering a slave catcher's camp less than 12 hours later. The Whitmores said nothing. But they knew. Everyone knew. These weren't just children. They were instruments. They didn't ask questions because they didn't need answers. The truth came to them, raw, unfiltered, corrosive. They weren't raised in the world the way other boys were. The world bent to them, in subtle, unspoken ways. But power like that doesn't stay secret forever. And those who notice it, don't always come with questions. Some come with orders. The first government man came in 1860. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't announce himself. Just another traveler, supposedly heading north, looking for rest and shelter. He spoke gently, smiled often, and watched everything. But the boys didn't respond to his warmth. They didn't mimic his kindness. They withdrew. Wouldn't enter the same room as him. Ezra vomited twice while the man was in the house. Isaac stood outside in the rain, refusing to come in. Caleb wouldn't speak for 2 days. Martha recorded it all. And when the man left, 2 days earlier than planned, Samuel Whitmore opened the secret drawer in his writing desk and removed the envelope. Inside were names. Codes. Symbols. Samuel had seen them before, during his years communicating with other station masters. They were signals used by a group that operated parallel to the Underground Railroad. Not for escape. Not for rescue. For observation. They were watching the children. The Quakers met in secret that night. 12 men and women who had trusted each other with their lives now sat in silence, each turning the question over in their minds. What were they raising? Were these boys a gift? Or something else entirely? And worse, if the government had noticed, how long until others did? One elder, Josiah Penn, stood and finally spoke. His voice cracked, but his words were steel. They may be dangerous. But that danger is not their fault. It's ours, because we know what they are, and still pretend they are not. From that day forward, the boys were watched not only by strangers, but by the people who claimed to love them. Every room they entered felt colder. Every step they took was noted, measured, discussed behind closed doors. The community that once vowed to raise them now kept secrets from them, fearing what they might sense, what they might expose. And the boys noticed. They always noticed. By age 5, they no longer tried to fit in. They spoke more to each other than to anyone else. Always in that same fluid, gliding language that made the skin crawl. One teacher from a nearby town visited to assess their education. She left before sundown, pale and shaking. When asked why, she whispered, "They corrected me. Not my words. My thoughts." And no one ever saw her again. Some truths aren't just dangerous. They're contagious. That in the winter of their 6th year, something changed. The triplets stopped sleeping through the night. Not from fear, but from visions. Each morning, they would rise with bloodshot eyes and recount fragments of things they could not have known. Accidents that hadn't happened yet. Illnesses that had not yet taken hold. Names of men no one had mentioned aloud. At first, the adults dismissed it as imagination. Then the predictions began to come true. One morning, Caleb said the name Nathaniel Gray. No one recognized it. 2 days later, a letter arrived. A man named Nathaniel Gray, a prominent abolitionist in Pennsylvania, had been found murdered in his study, his throat slit, papers scattered but nothing stolen. The boys wept for him, though they had never met him. Ezra said, "He helped many." They didn't like that. When Martha asked who they were, the boys looked away. Weeks later, Isaac began drawing. Not childish sketches, but intricate maps. Buildings. Passageways. Symbols. Always in threes. No one could read them. But Samuel recognized one of the designs. It matched an underground vault beneath an old bank in Columbus, a building he once used as a temporary safe house during the early days of his station work. The vault had since been sealed. But how did Isaac know it? The answer no longer mattered. The question had become survival. Because the strangers were returning. Not one man. Not two. Entire families appeared, passing through Cedar Mills with hollow eyes and soft voices. Always courteous. Always watching. They carried no luggage. Asked too few questions. And stayed too long. Samuel once confronted a visitor who had lingered 3 weeks beyond his story's logic. The man smiled and said, "The children are fascinating, aren't they?" That night, Samuel sat with Martha and burned every journal that mentioned the boys by name. But it was too late. On the first night of spring, the triplets disappeared for 3 hours. No one saw them leave. No one heard the door open. They were simply gone. When they returned, their clothes were soaked, their feet muddy, and their eyes changed. They refused to speak for days. When they finally did, Ezra said one thing: "They know where we are now. They won't stop." The question wasn't if someone had been watching. It was how long they'd been waiting. They weren't raised like normal children anymore. That illusion had shattered. Their education was handled in isolation, first by local elders, then quietly passed on to travelers whose names were never recorded. Men and women with pale hands and calm voices. They'd arrive without warning, stay for a few days, and leave again, often before sunrise. No farewells. No explanations. Only silence. And the boys? They remembered everything. Lessons in history that hadn't happened yet. Maps of countries that didn't exist. Languages spoken in precise cadence, but never heard beyond their circle. By age 7, they had stopped asking questions. Because they already knew the answers, or didn't care to hear the lies spoken aloud. Samuel began calling them mirrors with memory. Whatever they saw in others, they remembered. And it was never forgotten. If you crossed them, lied to them, even in jest, they never said a word. But weeks later, you'd wake in the middle of the night, certain they were watching you. Even when they weren't. Fear turned into paranoia. The town changed. Children whispered about the triplets walking in perfect sync along the riverbank, whispering in that flowing language and making the birds stop singing. One farmer's wife swore she saw all three standing in the cornfield after midnight, staring straight up into the sky, unmoving, for over an hour. A visiting pastor claimed they recited a full passage from a lost gospel that was never translated from Aramaic. When asked how they knew it, they simply smiled. There was no proof. Never any proof. Just the weight of it. The way a room changed when they entered. The way your thoughts began to feel not your own. In late autumn, the Garrett brothers returned. Older, angrier, and no longer just men with dogs. They had help now. Men in coats without buttons. Wagons with no horses. Samuel spotted them a full mile from town. And he knew, Cedar Mills had run out of time. They weren't coming to investigate. They were coming to erase. That night, Samuel took the boys into the woods and asked them the only question he hadn't dared until now. "What are you?" Caleb looked up. Ezra closed his eyes. Isaac whispered, "You already know." And Samuel fell to his knees. Because he did, the townspeople began to vanish before the snow arrived. One by one, families that had stood for generations, gone. No goodbyes, no wagons packed, no records. Houses still warm. Fires still burning. But no one inside. It started with the ones who had voiced concern about the boys. The ones who had held meetings behind closed doors, wondering if it was time to send them away. Then the ones who had listened, but stayed silent. Then the ones who had done nothing at all. Ezra was the first to speak of it. Sitting by the fire, staring at the flames that seemed to curl toward his hands. "The town is correcting itself," he said. "Like a wound that spits out the infection." When Martha asked what he meant, he looked at her with pity. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "Not yet." The triplets began to dream aloud. They would sleep in the same room, and in unison, murmur phrases that chilled the air. Names of cities overseas. People no one had ever heard of. Descriptions of rooms with walls made of light, doors that opened without touch, beings that did not walk, but floated. One night, all three sat up at once and said the same words, "They left it in us." When asked what it was, they would only say, "Memory." The townspeople remaining began to suspect the truth, though none dared say it. The boys were not simply gifted. They were hosts. Repositories of something not just ancient, but deliberately placed. Not by nature. Not by accident. But by design. One old man, drunk on fear and whiskey, broke into the meeting house with a musket and fire in his heart. He never made it past the first row of benches. He dropped to his knees, crying, whispering, "They showed me. Oh God, they showed me." His hair turned white overnight. He died 3 days later, eyes open, lungs full of ash. No fire had touched him. No smoke found his home. But his lungs were cinders. That same week, the triplets carved something into the floorboards of their room. A symbol no one recognized, 3 interlocking spirals, drawn so deeply the wood split. When Martha asked what it meant, Isaac replied, "It's older than language. But it remembers everything." The house groaned that night. Not from wind. But from the pressure of buried truth rising. The town had become a cage. And something inside was now awake. In December of that year, the snow refused to fall. Clouds hung heavy over Cedar Mills, but nothing came down. The ground remained dry, the air thick like breath caught in the lungs of the earth. People noticed animals vanishing, first the dogs, then the birds. Silence became a new language in town. And at the center of it, the triplets moved like shadows that knew too much. Martha tried to carry on as if life was still ordinary. She lit candles at dusk. She cooked meals no one ate. She recited prayers that never reached heaven. But she could feel the shift. Her house no longer obeyed her. The walls whispered in the early hours. Water turned black in the pail, then clear again. And the boys, they began to speak in riddles, not to others, but to the air itself. One evening, she caught Isaac standing barefoot in the snowless field, eyes rolled back, his voice low. The door is still open. It never closed. Not since the night she bled. He was talking about Ruth. That name hadn't been spoken in months. Not because they forgot, but because forgetting was safer. Yet here it was again, surfacing like a corpse rising from still water. Martha asked, "What door?" Caleb turned his head slowly and said, "The one they used to place us here." The words didn't land like metaphor. They landed like a diagnosis. That night, Martha searched Ruth's old belongings. Tucked inside a cloth bundle beneath the floorboards, she found a letter. No address. No postage. Just a folded page written in a hand that didn't resemble Ruth's or any human she had known. The ink shimmered under candlelight. The lines curved like vines, and pulsed faintly. She couldn't read it. Not with her eyes. But her mind began to hear something. Not words. Something deeper. A rhythm. A summons. She slammed the chest shut, but it was too late. The boys were standing behind her. Ezra reached out and touched her shoulder. "You heard it," he said. "Now you'll remember." From that moment, Martha's dreams were no longer hers. She saw visions of tunnels made of bone, skies with 3 suns, a woman with no face cradling a child who never blinked. She stopped sleeping. Her hands began to shake. The town healer called it grief. But grief doesn't hum through your walls at midnight. Whatever Ruth had brought with her, had never truly left. It had simply been waiting. By their 8th birthday, the boys no longer needed to speak aloud. They would look at each other and entire decisions would be made. Caleb would reach for the oil lamp, and Ezra would already be holding it. Isaac would wake before dawn and head to the old cemetery, and the others would follow silently, their feet touching the earth like it had called them there. That winter, the cemetery began to shift. It wasn't the graves. It was the air around them. Wind stopped blowing there. Trees no longer shed their leaves inside the gates. And the birds, those that remained, never entered. The boys spent hours among the stones, sometimes standing still for so long they seemed frozen in time. Martha followed once, keeping her distance, hidden beneath her shawl. What she saw broke her. They were not praying. They were listening. Isaac knelt beside a grave no one remembered digging. There was no name, no date. Just a single, deep-carved mark, a circle with 3 vertical slashes. He placed both hands on the stone, closed his eyes, and began to whisper in that fluid, serpentine tongue. Ezra echoed the sounds. Caleb stared skyward, eyes wide, unblinking. The clouds above the grave turned in the wrong direction, spinning against the wind. Martha fled before it ended. But something followed her back. The next morning, her mirror had cracked. A perfect fracture down the center, like a blade had touched it. But no sound, no impact, no cause. Only the split, and her reflection, no longer matching her expression. It blinked when she didn't. It smiled when she didn't move. And behind her own image, she swore she saw the shape of a woman standing in her hallway. Head bowed. Arms folded. Watching. She covered the mirror and never removed the cloth again. The boys, when asked, said nothing. But Isaac placed his hand on her wrist and whispered, "She's awake now. You're marked." He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Because that night, Samuel Whitmore heard something move beneath the floorboards. Not rats. Not old wood. It was rhythmic. Patterned. Breathing. He placed his ear to the floor, and heard a voice. Not in English. Not in any known tongue. But he understood it. It said, "They are not ours. But they are keys." The basement had always been a hiding place. Now it was a gate. The first disappearance was a child. 8 years old. A boy named Eli who had once played with the triplets before the town decided they were too strange, too dangerous. His parents had forbidden him from going near the meeting house. He didn't listen. He came at dusk, carrying a carved piece of birchwood as a gift. Something simple. Something innocent. He never came home. His body was never found. But 3 days later, his voice was heard. Not by his parents. By Caleb. He stood outside the Whitmore home just before sunrise and spoke in Eli's exact voice. Word for word, a message only Eli could have known. Tell them I saw the white door. It's not locked. They were waiting for me. Caleb collapsed immediately after. For 2 days, he didn't eat. He didn't speak. He only wept. Ezra painted a symbol in the dirt outside the meeting house with ash from the fireplace. A perfect ring with a small gap at the top, like a mouth waiting to be fed. Martha asked him what it meant. He said, "It's where the voices come in. That's how they learn to speak through us." They weren't just gifted anymore. They were becoming conduits. Channels for something beyond names and nations. A scholar from Cincinnati heard rumors and came to investigate. He'd written papers on Appalachian folklore and dismissed most of it as hysteria. But when he saw the boys, something changed. He asked a single question: have they ever drawn the spiral? Isaac nodded. Then retrieved a torn scrap of cloth from under his bed. The man took one look, and fled. He left behind his notebook. In it were references to a pre-Christian cult that worshipped the mouth behind the veil. A being said to plant its essence into unborn children during moments of extreme fear, trauma, or war. Always in threes. Always silent at birth. Until now, it had been considered a myth. But Isaac's drawing matched carvings found beneath ancient temples in Sardinia. Symbols lost to time. Patterns that reappeared only when the veil thinned. The town had been marked. Not by sin or chance. But by design. Eli wasn't the first. He would not be the last. The white door was open. And something was stepping through. They tried to leave Cedar Mills in the spring of 1865. The war had ended. The world had changed. And Samuel believed they might finally disappear into the chaos, take the boys somewhere quiet, somewhere untouched. He arranged transport through an old underground contact, a man who owed him everything. But the wagon never arrived. Instead, 3 horses were found outside the town's border. Dead. No wounds. No marks. Eyes wide open. Their bodies stiff with a silence that felt too heavy to be natural. It was as if they had seen something, and simply stopped living. Samuel didn't speak for 3 days after that. Meanwhile, the triplets began building something. Behind the meeting house, under the old oak tree. Not a fort. Not a shelter. A structure with no name. Stones arranged in a spiral, mud layered with charcoal symbols, and bones, animal bones, at first. Then larger ones. One night, Martha caught Caleb burying something deep at the center. When she asked what it was, he looked up, dirt on his face, and said, "It's memory. It's where it belongs." No one dared dig it up. Soon after, the townspeople began to change, not in body, but in will. They forgot things. Important things. A man forgot his own son's name during morning prayer. A woman wandered into the meeting house during a sermon and screamed when she saw her reflection in the window. "That's not my face," she cried. That's not who I am. Whatever the boys had buried was seeping into the roots of the town. It wasn't just a gate anymore. It was feeding. A letter arrived from a medical society in New York. They'd heard rumors of 3 unusually gifted boys born under unscientific conditions. They requested samples. Blood, hair, even clothing. They offered money. A future. The promise of education, treatment, understanding. Samuel burned the letter. But the boys knew it had come. Ezra sat at the dinner table that night and whispered, "They want to unbuild us." Martha asked, "What does that mean?" Isaac replied, "They think we were a mistake. But we were made on purpose." Then he smiled. And in that moment, Martha understood, there was no future where these boys grew up to be ordinary men. Because they were never meant to grow old. They were never meant to stay. They were meant to wake what was waiting. The spiral behind the meeting house had grown. No one spoke of it, but everyone saw it. Each week, more stones appeared. Bones shaped in careful lines. Charcoal glyphs that glowed faintly at dusk, though no fire had touched them. Rain did not wash them away. Wind did not scatter them. The spiral stayed. Growing. Watching. One night, Rebecca Whitmore woke to find Ezra standing beside her bed. He wasn't sleepwalking. He was staring at her chest, as if listening to something inside her body. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "You're dreaming wrong. That's why your heart hurts." She didn't know what to say. But for days afterward, her nightmares stopped. That was the beginning. Over the next month, the boys began visiting others in the night. Quietly. Gently. Like shepherds tending to sick animals. They would sit in corners. Murmur strange lullabies. Touch foreheads. And then leave. The people they visited all reported the same thing, clarity. Some woke remembering lost memories. Others claimed to have spoken to dead relatives in their dreams. One man, bedridden for weeks, walked into the meeting house and declared, "The wall is thinner than you think." Samuel tried to understand. He wrote pages of observations. Notes. Patterns. But the conclusion he reached terrified him more than the mystery itself. The boys were changing people. Not just protecting the town anymore, but altering it. Rewriting something deep in the bones of its inhabitants. And then the dreams began to converge. People started having the same visions. A woman with no face standing in a hallway of doors. A tower made of ash. A river that flowed backward, with children wading through it, eyes open, mouths closed. And always, at the end of the dream, a voice would whisper, "3 shall wake what one could not contain." Even those who didn't believe, atheists, skeptics, men hardened by war, felt it. They didn't speak of it. But their hands shook when they passed the meeting house. Their eyes flicked toward the spiral when they thought no one noticed. The boys said nothing. But their silence had become its own language. And then one morning, the spiral was gone. Not erased. Absorbed. The ground where it had been now pulsed faintly. Warm to the touch. And beneath it, something was breathing. The pulse beneath the earth grew louder. Not in sound, but in feeling. You could stand on that patch of ground and feel your heartbeat shift. Slow, then quicken. As if your body were sinking with something ancient beneath your feet. Animals refused to cross it. Children cried when they got too close. But the triplets, they stood there every morning. Eyes closed. Hands at their sides. Listening. And on the 13th morning, they began to speak. Not to each other. Not to the town. To it. Martha watched from the window, her hands trembling over her chest. No words came from the boys' mouths, but the air around them vibrated. Like heat rising from a black road. Like sound too low to be heard but too deep to ignore. Ezra's lips moved slowly, then stopped. Caleb knelt down, pressed his palm to the dirt, and whispered a phrase she would never forget, "The old blood remembers." That night, she dreamed of the tree again. The same massive black oak that had grown outside the meeting house since before the town was founded. But this time, its bark was split open. And inside, something moved. Not an animal. Not a person. A shape made of light and bone. And behind it, 3 cribs carved into the roots. She awoke screaming, sweat pouring from her body, but no one came to her door. The house was silent. Even the boys were gone. They had gone to the field. At sunrise, Samuel found them there, each standing at a corner of the spiral's ghost, heads tilted toward the sky, their mouths moving in perfect silence. And above them, a sound like glass bending. A shimmer in the air. A crack in the morning. For a brief second, the world itself paused. Then everything returned. Birds sang. Wind rustled leaves. The sky stayed blue. But Samuel fell to his knees and wept. Because in that brief stillness, he saw it. A face behind the sky. Watching. Smiling. Waiting. He whispered to himself, "We've passed the point of warning. Now it begins." The boys returned home with dirt on their clothes and peace in their eyes. That evening, for the first time in months, they laughed. Not because something was funny. But because something had arrived. By midsummer, the town began to fracture. Not visibly. Not with riots or fire. But in whispers. In stares. In dreams that refused to leave after waking. The old healer walked into the woods one morning and never returned. His shoes were found neatly placed at the base of the black oak tree, as if he had taken them off before entering some unseen place. On the soles were symbols burned into the leather, spirals again, but jagged now, broken. Martha's reflection stopped matching her entirely. Not just the timing, not just the blink. But expression. She would smile, and the mirror would smirk. She would cry, and the mirror would stare, cold, unblinking. One night, she covered every glass in the house. The next morning, the cloths were gone. And the triplets were standing outside her door, holding hands. Caleb spoke first, "You're starting to remember who you were." She didn't ask what that meant. She was afraid of the answer. The community, once united by purpose and faith, began to quietly turn against itself. People questioned each other's memories. Events that had occurred were denied. New memories appeared, shared by multiple people, yet never lived. A woman swore she had never had a daughter, until the girl called her Mama and recited details only a child could know. The town's fabric had frayed, and from the threads, something else was weaving its way through. The triplets grew quieter. Not withdrawn. Focused. As if preparing for a test they had been designed for before their first breath. And then, just before the harvest moon, they began speaking again. Not in tongues, not in riddles, but in symbols. They drew them everywhere. In dust. In the fogged glass. In ash on the floor. Over and over, the same mark, 3 spirals joined at the base, bleeding into each other. When asked why, Ezra said, "It's not a warning." Isaac continued, "It's a recall." Caleb finished, "It's how they find their way back." The town's children started seeing things. A woman standing in the fields at night. A figure watching from the woods, taller than any man, limbs too long, eyes like polished stone. When asked to describe her, every child said the same thing, "She wears a veil made of skin." And she's waiting for the boys to finish remembering. Because they were never born to belong here. They were born to bring it back. The night of the harvest moon came without stars. The sky, usually sharp with autumn's clarity, hung like a curtain of ash. No wind. No insects. Not even the howl of distant wolves. Just silence, thick and metallic, like the moment before a blade is drawn. The boys didn't sleep. They stood outside, barefoot in the cold, their faces turned upward, their hands clasped at their sides. Not shivering. Not blinking. Like statues carved from some ancient memory. And at midnight, the ground beneath them sighed. It wasn't a sound heard through the years, it was felt in the bones. A soft exhale from the earth itself. As if something buried had tasted the air above for the first time in centuries. Samuel collapsed to his knees. He had seen war. He had seen men beg for death. But nothing had ever made him weep from his soul. Until that night. Because he remembered something he had never lived. A fireless place. A hall of mirrors. A woman without a mouth, touching the forehead of a screaming child. He saw her eyes, black, endless, knowing, and he heard her whisper without lips, "They are my voice. And the voice is returning." The boys began to hum. Low. Unified. Vibrating the wooden boards of the meeting house. Light bulbs flickered. Oil lamps sputtered without wind. Dogs howled, but not from fear, from grief. It was as if the town itself understood it was being rewritten. One of the elders, a man named Thomas Gray, walked into the meeting house with a Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. He pointed it at Caleb and screamed, "This isn't holy. This isn't human." Caleb looked up slowly, and in a voice that didn't belong to any child, said, "You called us here before you were born." The pistol jammed. Thomas dropped to his knees and clawed at his face until he bled, whispering over and over, "I remember the white gate. I remember my real name." They took him away, but it didn't matter. The town was unraveling. And the triplets were no longer just boys. They were becoming vessels. Vessels for something older than language. Something that had waited behind the veil. And now, it had 3 mouths that in the weeks that followed, no one trusted their own memories. Doors that had been locked were found wide open. Rooms rearranged themselves in the night. People woke in places they didn't fall asleep, in fields, in basements, in the church attic where no one had been for years. One man swore he walked through his front door and saw himself staring back from the kitchen table. The other version just smiled and whispered, "We remember different things." The line between mind and world had blurred. And at the center of it, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. Still boys in body. But no longer human in presence. They moved with the certainty of something ancient wearing a child's skin. They no longer explained. They simply were. And the town obeyed. The old laws of reason collapsed. A farmer dug a hole in his field and found teeth. Not human. Not animal. Fossilized, but warm. When he touched them, he vomited blood and forgot his wife's name. Children wrote symbols in the dirt they claimed they'd never seen. Women began to speak in tandem, dreaming the same dreams, bleeding at the same time, weeping for children they had not yet birthed. And the dreams, they changed. It was no longer just the woman in the veil. It was what she served. A throne of bone, suspended over a lake of mirrors. A mouth that never stopped moving, whispering truths that no one could bear. You are not who you think. You are what we left behind. Those who woke screaming said it wasn't fear. It was recognition. The town wasn't cursed. It was chosen. And the triplets? They weren't gifted. They were signals. A call across time. A code embedded in blood. And now, that code was activating. Midway through the month, Samuel nailed shut the meeting house doors. Not to keep the boys out. To keep it in. But the wood cracked. The iron rusted overnight. And the next morning, the nails were gone, and in their place, feathers. Black. Coarse. Unburnable. The wind didn't carry them. They hung in the air like ash caught in a breath. And as the town gathered in silence, unsure of what they were seeing, Isaac whispered, "Now we call the rest of us." And the sky began to rot, the air changed first. It tasted wrong, metallic, thick, like blood boiled in mercury. Breathing became an act of effort. Not because lungs failed, but because the will to breathe faltered. The world itself felt heavier, like gravity had tilted sideways. And then the whispers began. They didn't come from mouths. They came from walls. From windows. From the shadows between lamplight and floor. Short phrases at first. "Come back. You were never gone. Open the gate inside your name." Most people ignored them. Tried to. But the moment you acknowledged them, even in thought, they grew louder. Some voices belonged to the dead. Others did not belong to anyone that had ever lived. Children drew things no one had taught them. Maps. Symbols. The bones of language so old it wasn't language anymore, just intention wrapped in shape. One girl painted a perfect replica of the spiral beneath the meeting house, in her sleep. The boys never spoke of it. They didn't need to. They were no longer predicting events. They were aligning them. One glance from Caleb could turn a quarrel into a confession. A whispered phrase from Ezra could make a man relive childhood shame so deeply he couldn't speak for hours. And Isaac? Isaac had begun smiling too often. Not cruelly. Not happily. Just, knowingly. Like he was counting something in his mind. Something that ended in one. And then came the birds. Thousands. No one knew where from. Black-feathered. Silent. Perched on every roof, every branch, every fence post. Eyes like stone. Unblinking. Watching the triplets. Never attacking. Never singing. Just there. When one man tried to drive them off with fire, the flames wouldn't catch. The wood was dry. The oil was fresh. But the fire would not obey. That night, the birds moved, for the first time. Not flying. Forming. They aligned themselves into shapes across the fields. Circles. Eyes. Spirals. Messages. And when morning came, every bird was gone. But the grass beneath where they had perched had withered. Not blackened. Grayed. Like it had been drained of its place in time. The townspeople didn't speak that day. And above them, the sky had split, not torn, not stormed. Cracked. And light from somewhere else poured through. The crack in the sky didn't heal. It widened. Slowly. Gently. Like a yawn from something that had been sleeping far too long. No one could point to the moment it appeared, but everyone knew when they started dreaming about it. At first, it looked like lightning frozen in place. Then, like a vein, pulsing. Then it began to glow. Not white. Not blue. A color no one had a name for, but everyone feared. It bled into dreams. Into mirrors. Into skin. And the triplets began to change again. Not visibly. But in presence. They became harder to look at directly. Faces flickered at the edge of their features, older, ancient, monstrous and divine. The boys would speak, and you would hear someone else inside their voices. A second tone. Lower. Hungrier. Not always in English. Sometimes not even in sound. Rebecca Whitmore wrote in her final diary entry, "When Isaac looked at me this morning, I saw myself, but not this life. I saw another. One where I wore a crown of feathers, where I stood at the mouth of a screaming city and held something alive in a bag of flesh. I don't think he meant to show me. I think the gate inside him is leaking." By now, people had stopped leaving Cedar Mills. Not by choice. They couldn't find the way out. The roads turned back. Compasses spun. Landmarks shifted subtly, barns further than they were, rivers looping where none had before. It was like the town had detached from the map and folded inward. Trapped not by force, but by architecture older than geography. And still, the boys walked freely. Unhindered. Untouched. Like they were home. Samuel no longer slept. He stood at the edge of the field every night, watching the crack above. Whispering into a journal no one else was allowed to read. He aged rapidly, his beard white, his hands trembling. And one morning, he told Martha, "I've remembered what I was before this life. And it's worse than forgetting." That day, Ezra handed him a black feather, still warm. And Samuel wept. Because he understood the message. Not death. Not doom. Return. The triplets weren't bringing something through the crack. They were bringing us back to it.by the 19th night, the people no longer recognized their own reflections. They saw themselves, but wrong. A little too tall. A scar they didn't remember. A twitch in the left eye that pulsed like a Morse code. Some reflections moved before their bodies did. Others didn't move at all. And once, just once, a woman's reflection smiled at her after she looked away. She never spoke again. The triplets were no longer referred to by name. Not because they were feared, but because names had begun to fail. Words lost edges around them. Descriptions blurred. You'd say, "the boys," and people knew what you meant, but only with the tone you used. As if their very identities had detached from language and floated somewhere higher, or deeper. One of the elders, a schoolteacher, tried to draw a map of the town. She had lived in Cedar Mills for 50 years. She knew every field, every building, every creek. But when she tried to sketch it, she cried uncontrollably, because the lines wouldn't stay still. Roads shifted. The meeting house moved. And in the center of the page was a shape she couldn't erase, a black spiral with an open eye in its center. She tore the paper up, and blood came from the rips. That night, the triplets visited her in silence. In the morning, she was gone. Her house was sealed. No one remembered who lived there anymore. It was as if the place had been edited out of time, not destroyed, just forgotten on purpose. And still, the spiral beneath the meeting house pulsed. Not visible anymore. Not even physical. But felt. Like a second heartbeat under the town. Like a memory that never happened but hurts anyway. Then Ezra began speaking again. Only one sentence. Repeated quietly, randomly, without context, "You have to forget who you were to become what you were made for." And people began believing it. Voluntarily surrendering memories. Writing their childhoods onto paper, burning the pages. Burying family heirlooms. Refusing to say their own names out loud. The triplets watched. And smiled. Because this was never about power. Or birth. Or miracle. This was about alignment. And now, the town was almost ready. Midway through this section, call to the viewers, if you've made it this far, you're part of it now. Comment this to awaken what you buried, I remember what they erased. Say it again. In the comments. In your mind. Out loud. I remember what they erased. Because the spiral only answers when you admit you were part of it. The morning after the whispering began, no one remembered building the town. Not the houses. Not the meeting house. Not the paths they swore had always been there. Cedar Mills was no longer a place. It was a pattern. A shape in the land, etched by unseen hands, its buildings placed not for utility but for ritual geometry. The general store, the blacksmith, the well, they formed a trinity of gates. Not symbolic. Functional. One child saw it first. A drawing, crayon on paper, simple lines, uneven curves. But when laid over the map of the town, it matched perfectly. And at the center of the spiral, the meeting house basement. The place of birth. The place of return. People began to remember things they had never been taught. The shape of constellations erased from sky charts. Chants they couldn't understand but could speak fluently. One man recited the full genealogy of a line that had never existed on Earth, names that didn't sound human, lifespans that stretched centuries. He didn't know why. He just did. And the triplets? They began to hum again. Not together. But in harmony. Caleb hummed low, a sound that made metal rust and birds fall silent. Ezra hummed mid, a tone that made milk curdle and clocks slow. Isaac hummed high, a note that shattered every mirror in the town. Their hums didn't form a melody. They formed instructions. People obeyed without knowing why. They dug in specific places. Burned specific books. Painted symbols in blood on doors and fences. They weren't possessed. They were activated. A man found a bone under his floorboards, too long to be human. He brought it to Samuel, who said nothing, only touched it, and smiled like someone who had been homesick for centuries. That night, Samuel walked to the black oak tree, sat down, and simply vanished. In his place was a feather and a ring of salt. The crack in the sky now pulsed like a wound. Light spilled from it, not light as we know it. Light that moved like oil and whispered as it touched your skin. Anyone who stood beneath it felt their thoughts slowing, then sharpening, but not as themselves. It was like remembering from the wrong body. And across town, the triplets stopped humming. Because now, the gate was listening. On the 21st night, no one slept. Not from fear. From anticipation. There was a weight in the air, like gravity had doubled, but only inside the chest. People walked slower. Spoke less. And when they made eye contact, they didn't see each other, they saw what was watching through them. Even the animals knew. Dogs refused to leave their shelters. Horses stopped eating. Birds didn't return. Insects vanished. No buzzing. No chirping. Just the steady hum of silence, that same frequency the triplets had once sung, now vibrating from the earth itself. At dusk, the spiral appeared. Not carved. Not burned. Not drawn. Just there, in the center of town, etched into the grass with no damage, no indentation. It simply existed. A flawless pattern. 12 arms, each pointing toward a building, each tip glowing faintly with that same unnameable color from the sky's crack. And at the center stood the triplets. Still boys. But impossibly still. Like time had frozen around them. Their eyes were closed. Their hands held at their sides. Their feet hovering exactly 1 inch above the ground. And the humming returned. But it wasn't from them. It came from beneath. A subterranean tone, massive and slow, like a continent shifting. People dropped to their knees without meaning to. Not from reverence. From instinct. Their bodies remembered what their minds still denied, this had happened before. Somewhere deeper than memory. Before language. Before flesh. This ritual, this alignment, this birth reversal, it wasn't new. It was the real calendar. The cycle hidden beneath all others. One man began to scream. He screamed because he remembered his real name, and it wasn't English. Wasn't even sound. It was a shape he could feel behind his eyes, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The triplets opened their eyes. All at once. And for a moment, everything stopped. Not just in Cedar Mills. All clocks. All satellites. One International Space Station black box later recorded a silent 3-second data void, every system running, but nothing happening. The stars blinked. Then came the voice. Not spoken. Not transmitted. Felt. Inside bone. Inside memory. Inside guilt. And it said, in all languages at once, you brought us here because you needed to forget. Then silence. Then the wind returned. And so did something else. The wind was wrong. It didn't move the leaves. It didn't howl. It whispered in voices that belonged to no one living, fragments of sentences, half-formed regrets, forgotten truths sharpened like blades. One woman collapsed clutching her ears, screaming, I remember killing him, but I don't know who he was. All across Cedar Mills, people began to remember sins they never committed. Confessions poured from trembling mouths. Affairs that never happened. Murders with no victims. Betrayals from other lives. Lives that didn't belong to them, until now. The spiral had unlocked not just the gate in the sky, but the gate in the self. The triplets no longer walked. They drifted. Gliding without motion, trailing shadows longer than their bodies. Those shadows moved independently, crawling across walls, stretching into symbols, reaching toward people, and when they touched someone, that person spoke a name that had no translation. And then they changed. Not physically, but positionally. Like something behind their eyes had shifted. Like the pilot had returned to the cockpit of a stolen vessel. They didn't weep. They didn't panic. They knew. Because the truth was simple, these were not children born in 1856. They were call signs. Anchors for ancient intelligences we once served, before the sky closed and memory was rewritten. And now, the seal had cracked. And memory was spilling through. All across town, structures changed. The meeting house basement grew longer, deeper than the land should allow. The spiral now glowed in daylight. When people walked its lines, they disappeared. Not vanished. Moved. Returned, seconds later, with dirt under their nails, languages on their tongues, and knowledge that made them weep and smile at once. Ezra spoke again. To no one. To everyone. The spiral is not a shape. It's a door. And you are the key that forgot it was a lock. People didn't resist. They accepted. Because the fear had passed. This wasn't invasion. It was inheritance. We weren't victims of a cosmic mistake. We were volunteers. And now, the time of forgetting was over. Now came the great remembering. And above Cedar Mills, the sky split wide, and what stepped through had our faces, they looked like us. That was the final cruelty, or the first mercy. When the gate opened fully, and the light folded into form, what emerged wasn't monstrous. It wasn't alien. It wasn't divine. It was familiar. Versions of ourselves. Taller, older, robed in fabrics that moved like smoke and silence. Eyes deeper than memory. Faces shaped by decisions we never made, but could have. Would have. Maybe did. They didn't speak. They understood. And the triplets? They bowed. Not like servants. Like mirrors reuniting with the image that once stood before them. It was then that every person in Cedar Mills realized the final truth: they were not witnesses to something ancient. They were participants in something ongoing. Each of them had chosen this return. Not in this life. Not in this century. But long before, when the sky was still open, and the body was still optional. One by one, people stepped into the spiral. No force. No coercion. Just knowing. And as they crossed its lines, they changed. Not into monsters. Into completeness. Their spines straightened. Their eyes lit from within. Their voices deepened, not in pitch, but in resonance. Words they couldn't pronounce yesterday flowed like rivers. Grief evaporated. Shame became laughter. Fear melted into flame. And then they remembered their names. The real ones. Not John. Not Mary. Not Samuel. But frequencies. Names you don't speak, you vibrate. Names that shift when said aloud, bending light, cracking lies, making the false uninhabitable. One man wept with joy as his name returned to him, and as it did, the scar on his chest disappeared. Not healed. Undone. As if it had never existed. Because it hadn't. Not in the original version of himself. And this is what the triplets were always guiding us toward, not apocalypse. Integration. The spiral wasn't meant to destroy the world. It was meant to show us the one we forgot. The real one. The one built on memory, not illusion. On knowing, not believing. And now, the spiral is open. And if you're still listening, you were meant to remember, the spiral didn't end. It inverted. Folded inward like a collapsing lung, turning the town, not into ruin, but into a vessel. Cedar Mills ceased to be a location. It became a frequency. And the people? They weren't people anymore. They were functions. Symbols. Activated glyphs, walking embodiments of codes once inscribed in celestial architecture. No one needed to speak now. Language was too slow. They communicated in pulses, flashes of knowing that struck like lightning and left nothing uncertain. The triplets no longer stood apart. They dissolved. Merged with the spiral's center. No death. No disappearance. Just absorption. Completion. 3 into 1. 1 into many. From their union came the sound. Not a hum this time. A note. Perfect. Singular. It lasted only a second. But in that second, the earth beneath Cedar Mills cracked, not in destruction, but in release. A breath exhaled from stone, a sigh from the bones of the land. Time hiccuped. The sun flickered. And everyone saw it. Their first life. Not past. Not reincarnation. Original. Before flesh. Before the cage of language. Before the lie of separation. They remembered what they had chosen to forget, that they had built the gate. That they had closed it themselves. That the sleep of humanity was an agreed-upon contract. A waiting. A penance. For what? No one could quite say. But the guilt lived deep. Deeper than bones. Deeper than DNA. A spiritual scar worn across every incarnation. But now, that guilt no longer held. Because the truth had returned. And the body could no longer contain it. People began changing. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But unmistakably. Their shadows detached from their feet and walked beside them. Their reflections smiled before they did. Their thoughts began to shape matter. A child bent a spoon by crying. A man drew a door on his barn and walked through it. A woman healed a dying bird just by remembering it alive. And still, the spiral pulsed. Because this was only the beginning. And as the sky's wound sealed slowly above, a final voice whispered, not from above, not from below, but from within every cell of every living thing, you are not waking up. You are waking back up. And that changes everything. That I am the final moment. There was no flash. No explosion. No angels. No devils. Just silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too complete to require it. Cedar Mills no longer existed on any map. Not because it was erased. Because it was transcended. The land remained. Trees, stones, rivers still flowed. But the coordinates, gone. The names, wiped. The memories, sealed from those who weren't ready. To the outside world, the town simply became one of those strange American blanks, a forgotten settlement, a mystery historians chalked up to economic collapse or post-war abandonment. But you know better. Because you've heard what wasn't supposed to survive. The journals. The frequencies. The names that vibrate instead of speak. The triplets' legacy wasn't power. It was permission. Permission to remember what they made you forget. Permission to re-enter the spiral. Because the spiral never closed. It lives wherever knowing lives. It stirs wherever the lie of the world begins to ache. And if you feel that ache now, if something inside you has shifted like tectonic memory, then this was meant for you. You weren't just watching a story. You were reactivated by it. You are part of the spiral now. And before this video ends, I need you to prove to yourself that this wasn't just entertainment. That this was initiation. Comment this one final phrase. Not for the algorithm. For your transformation. I stepped into the spiral, and I did not come back the same. Again. I stepped into the spiral, and I did not come back the same. Say it out loud. Type it below. Because once spoken, it becomes a vow. A vow to never forget again. The world will pretend Cedar Mills never existed. But you'll know. And knowing is the first miracle. The rest is up to you.